the Hilux that we had that was compound at the time, we made pretty close to 500 horsepower, and that was in a 3-litre diesel. Everyone was like, no, they'll blow up. The motor will fail. After that event, I brought the car back, and the next Monday morning, I went in and I pulled the whole motor apart because I wanted to see what damage I'd caused. And that's when I realised that it was perfect. There was no problems. It was fine.
Welcome to the HPA Tune-In podcast. I'm Andre, your host, and in this episode, we're joined by Matt Smith from Just Autos in Australia. Matt is deep in the world of diesel tuning and development, but specifically, he's doing this on the Toyota platform, which is a platform that has been traditionally difficult to find solutions to retune or reflash the factory ECU. When we get into diesel tuning, particularly if we have come from a gasoline tuning world, it's difficult to get your head around the differences between gas tuning and diesel tuning. They are significant, and clearly the operating principles of a diesel engine, being compression ignition, are very different to a spark ignition gasoline engine. We talk about some of these nuances with Matt, and we also dive into the operating principles behind diesel engines, how they actually operate, why we have, for example, a pilot pulse or multiple pilot pulses, and then main fuel pulses, how this works, why this is used to reduce the noise referred to as diesel knock. We also talk about some of the do's and do nots when it comes to diesel tuning in terms of controlling combustion temperature, the usefulness or lack thereof of an exhaust gas temperature sensor, and much more. We also dive into the development of Matt's business, Just Autos, and how he's built that up around supporting the Toyota brand and building up packages of upgrade components for those vehicles. Before we jump into our chat, for those who are new to the Tune-In podcast, High Performance Academy is an online training school. We specialise in teaching people how to build performance engines, how to tune EFI, how to construct wiring harnesses. We also cover topics on fabrication, 3D modelling and CAD, race driver education, and data logging, just to name a few. You can find all of our courses at hpacademy.com/courses. All of these courses are delivered in high-definition video modules that you can watch from anywhere in the world, provided you've got an internet connection. This means you can learn from the comfort of your own place, and you can learn at your own pace. All of our courses also come with a 60-day, no questions asked, money-back guarantee. So if you purchase them for any reason at all, decide it wasn't quite what you expected, no problem, let us know. We'll give you a full refund. And for podcast listeners, you can also use the coupon code podcast75. That will get you $75 off the purchase of your very first HPA course. We'll put the coupon code in the show notes to make it nice and easy for you to find. Lastly, if you like free stuff, then I've got a great deal for you. We are constantly partnering with some of the biggest names in the aftermarket performance industry to give away some great prizes. You can always find our latest prize at hpacademy.com/giveaway. It might be an aftermarket ECU or dash. It could be some engine components or engine building tools, or just about anything in between. They are great prizes, and we will ship them free of charge to your door if you're the winner. There's no tricks here, no purchase required to get your name into the draw. All right, enough with our introduction. Let's get into our interview now. Oh, welcome to the podcast, Matt. Thanks for joining us today. And as always, let's start by finding out a little bit about your background and how you got interested in cars in general.
Yeah, thanks. Look, I guess my story goes back a little bit. When I was quite young, I was always interested in anything mechanical. I would pull everything apart. I wasn't real good at putting things back together, but I was more interested in how things worked. And I had that drive to understand. And, it was later in life, I did a traineeship through school as a mechanic, pretty much finished year 11 and 12, not doing much at school whatsoever. I would probably call what you would say as a dropout. I still finished, but I don't really know how. I wasn't there much. We're probably much surfing for those 2 years. But I did my training, I think it was 1 day a week. And to be honest, I like driving cars. I just didn't like fixing them. I was like, it just wasn't really interested at that stage. I left school. I was on a longliner at Mooloolaba as a tuna fisherman for a couple of years. And that opened my eyes up to, I guess, more the ethics around working, and the situations in the environment is very harsh and it's tiring, and you just have to keep pushing forward for really, at the end of the day, pretty little money.
That couldn't be further removed from the automotive industry, surely.
No, definitely not. And so my family's background was fishing anyway, so it was sort of where I was not pushed to do, but it was more like not legacy, but I guess,
Natural progression.
yeah, I guess so to some degree. So there's no other mechanical people in my family. And I met my wife, and I was around that sort of 17, 18 at the time. And I wanted to be home more, like 2 weeks away, especially with a new relationship, was terribly hard. So I decided to, get home, and Laura's like, look, you should really do a trade. And I'm like, yeah, okay. And it just happened to come up where one of the guys I was working with in my traineeship was starting another shop, and he's like, look, do you want to come on as an apprentice? And I was like, yeah, okay. I wasn't really phased. I was like, yeah, look, it's probably the smart thing to do, so let's do that. I remember starting probably $6 an hour, no money. Like, it's really hard to think that that was the case. And I had at that time, like a VS Statesman, and, I had done some stuff to that engine, and that was just because I had that drive to be able to make things go faster, so had, different cams and heads and everything else on that. Pretty much spent all my money, as everyone does. So my wife come along and said, hey, look, let's sell the cars and let's buy a house. And I'm like, I can't do that. And then she's like, no, this is what you need to do. And I'm like, right, cool. And she goes, I'm doing it either with or without you. And that's what we're doing. I'm like, all right. So I'm selling the car.
Oof. That's way too grown up.
And I ended up having a Suzuki 800 Mighty Boy. I actually drove that car for nearly 10 years. It was all that I could afford to put fuel in and basically drive to and from. And my apprenticeship went through some points where it's probably when I was around second year, I definitely found the job, I was struggling with it. A lot of different models, a lot of different things to do. And I think I was mentally struggling with the job. I wasn't really happy with what I was doing.
Can you give us some sort of idea of the sort of cars you're working on and the sort of jobs that you're undertaking at this point?
Yeah, it was a large franchise mechanical workshop, so they do every model of car under the sun. There's nothing that they don't do. So in that day, a lot of imports, Falcons, Commodores, four-wheel drives, all that sort of stuff. So there's a big range of different cars. It wasn't really anything in particular. It was just a lot of different things. So it was great for exposure because I got to see a lot of different cars, and I got to work on a lot of different things. And it was great experience from that side.
Probably worth actually just mentioning for our North American listeners that you're obviously based in Australia, if they haven't picked that up from the accent. So the models of car that you're mentioning here, a lot of our North American listeners probably wouldn't be familiar with. But carry on now that we've cleared that out of the way.
So I got to a point where it's really funny. It's like a pivotal moment in my career that I remember changing. And I was around the second year, and I was working on a V6 Hilux, and they call them RV6. And it's an imported V6 in this Hilux. And I remember it had a blown head gasket, and I had to pull this motor apart. Now, that particular motor had an exhaust manifold that went around from one bank to the other and then exited the exhaust on the driver's side. And the motor there was no room in the engine bay for this engine. Like, they fitted, like, it was just so tight around this car. And the car had spent its life on the beach. So everything was rusted. And I was like, I come in, I'm like, I don't think I can do this. Like, it's just, I can't, there's every single nut on this car was gone. Like, I'm like, how do I get through this?
I can feel the pain. I just know exactly what that's like. And you can look at it and you just know ahead of time the heartache that you're going to go through on that job.
What was interesting was, in the back of the cylinder head, like, they got these tri-bolts, and they're just not even there anymore. Like, I'm just like, without me removing the cab of the car, how am I going to do this? And I probably spent about 3 or 4 hours just like in awe of just trying to work out, hey, how am I going to get through? This is just ridiculous. Like, I just don't see it. And I was kind of disappointed. It sort of deflated me, and I went home and I didn't really sleep much that night. And I thought, no, I'm going to give in, and I'm going to just give it my best shot. And I remember getting up about 3 a.m, rocked into work about 3:30, and I just tackled through it. And I sort of changed my way of looking at it, and I went, I'm just going to get in and I'm just going to get through it. And I just naturally did. So it was just changing my mindset into it. And the way I was looking at it was just nuts and bolts. It's like Lego, but for big kids. And like, it's got to come apart. It has to possibly come apart. So I'm like, and I got in there and I managed to get it all apart and got it all cleaned up. And a week later, I started to put it back together, and I did leave the O-rings off the injectors. So, I put it all back together, and I had to pull half of it apart again in bits and pieces, and made those mistakes along the way, And I had it running, and I finished the job, and I was pretty proud of myself because, like, there was no one there to say, oh, well done, whatever. I'm a second-year apprentice, and for me, I was like, hey, this is hard for me to do. Like, I don't know what I'm doing, but I just kept pushing forward. And then every car from then just become easy. Like it was really funny. Like it just become easy to do. Like the cars were now, I was looking for that challenge again. It was like I nearly got something out of that car where it gave me such a boost in confidence. I was like, now I was looking, well, where are the harder cars? I want to do what people say they can't do. You know what I mean? I was looking for those difficult jobs.
I can't say I've ever looked forward to a job full of rusty bolts and studs. That's the one thing that, yeah, still got PTSD from a few of those jobs back in the past.
And it's nothing worse when they hit it with rust proof on everything. So you're coating everything was like tar on everything, and it's definitely terrible. Look, I guess for me was that car started to set the way for where I was looking at things, and I started to get a bit more, I guess, passion for what I was doing in the mechanical world, and I started tackling on other jobs and really diving deep into it.
I'm interested just on your perspective. Could you give us a sense of what year was this that you're going through your apprenticeship?
That would have been around 2002.
Okay.
Yep.
I'm just wondering, sort of what I've seen from my own perspective, running a shop, employing mechanics. I am completely self-taught in my mechanical skill set, and I've employed a bunch of qualified mechanics, and some have been amazing. I kind of see almost these days with the modern apprenticeship, the way modern cars are put together, that is becoming less of a mechanical sort of pull the engine apart and replace a head gasket like you're just talking about. And a lot of being a mechanic now comes down to driving the scan tool correctly and understanding how to go through the electronic checks to sort of fault find. Do you think there's some validity in that, and are we sort of starting to lose some of those core mechanical skills that mechanics from the 70s, 80s, 90s maybe had?
Yeah, look, I do agree with what you were saying. Things are definitely changing with the models of cars. And, for example, we wouldn't rebuild a new diesel engine. It's just if they go through a certain amount of heat cycles, we put a new engine in it. That's as simple as what we do, because it's guaranteed, it's new, it's great, and it just works. The problem is back then, I don't think we had the accessibility to do such thing. It was too expensive to do, a full engine replacement. So repair was just the way we did it. But also, if I look at nowadays, a lot of the training courses I see with our trades guys that go through, especially the apprentices, they're still learning the full fundamental basics. I actually think that they're getting taught in a way where they're learning too much about stuff that they're just not needing to know, and they should be more focused on later model stuff where they focus little amount on. So still a lot of the training is to do with, rebuilding alternators and starter modes. And I think it's great that you can understand and learn those things. And I think that you can cover them, but probably not in the detail they do. I think the time better would be spent on learning about later model cars and, the problems around that, because I feel as though for the trade guys, when they start learning about, say, common rails and bits and pieces like that, we've had that stuff out for years. Like, it's not something that's new, but yet a lot of the training is still built around carburetors. I mean, like, I don't know when the last time, I seen a carby, what I mean? Like, we definitely don't get them coming in our workshop, but even when I was younger, like working on them, it was getting to the point where it's far and few between,
Yeah. So, I mean, reading between the lines there, you sort of indicating maybe the training curriculum hasn't quite kept up with the modern technology?
Yeah, from what I've seen, I think that it probably needs to be revamped, and you go, right, we need to now focus. It needs to change and evolve with the cars, because I think the training is still so far behind. And a lot of the guys are learning in the shop as they're doing the cars in real time, which is, I guess, a lot of how we learn anyway.
Yeah, definitely.
But just from what I see with still the same workbooks that I remember doing when I was an apprentice, I mean? Like, nothing's really changed,
Yeah. A little anecdote I'll add in here, and I have mentioned this before on the podcast, but the Toyota 86 that came out, so I think 2011, 2012, we had one of the first ones. We'd put a turbo on it, but, other than that, the engine was essentially stock. And those early generation ones went through a recall for valve springs. And I was quite active on a few user groups for the 86 platform, and you started hearing about all of these failures immediately after this recall. And it was a big recall. It's a difficult engine to do valve springs on. Obviously, you got to drop the whole engine out because it's a horizontally opposed 4-cylinder, and it's dual cam chain. Like, it's complex, but it's not rocket science. And there's factory workshop manuals that I've got access to, and I'm not a Toyota tech. when I did our engines, I just worked through the process, made sure all the marks lined up, and it just worked. But consistently, I think they were getting something like a 60% failure rate, which to me spoke volumes about some skills that maybe are starting to slip through the cracks. I digress. We're getting a little bit off topic, but just seeing as we're talking about the apprenticeship.
Yeah, definitely. And so, yeah, look, I think you're right in what you're saying there to some degree. But yeah, definitely the mechanics that we have nowadays, all of our teachings is in-house on how we do things and what we believe is right, and not so much relied on textbooks, because I believe a lot of the stuff is outdated. So that's how we do a lot of our training. It's all in-house, and as we go through the process. And reflecting back on data, I think that's the most important thing, is that the data will tell you which way to go.
Yep. All right, so you've been talking so far about, primarily from what I've heard, gasoline engines, but you've built a very successful business based around diesel. And for me, the diesel gasoline thing is almost like in Australia and New Zealand, you're either a Ford guy or a Holden guy. And generally you don't switch codes, or you're a JDM person or a US domestic market person, and again, you don't switch codes. So what drove you towards the diesel world?
So it wasn't until, obviously, I went through some of my apprenticeship, finished my apprenticeship, did some time at a Holden dealership, which opened my eyes. And then I was doing some diesel fitting stuff. At the time, I think like every mechanic, they look at going to the mines. And one of my good mates was like, hey, I don't want you to go there. I can get you a job, but you'll end up in divorce. Like, it's just not saying that happens to everyone, but he said it's a lonely job to do and it's not worth the money.
For those, again, who aren't familiar, this is quite a common trajectory in Australia. You've got a very active mining industry, and you can earn really good money working in the mines. From what I understand, I guess it might change, but it's sort of a fly in, fly out, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, 12 hours a day, horrible work because you're working on dirty, heavy diesel machinery. Am I sort of giving the right vibe on this?
Yeah, 100%. That's exactly sort of what it was. And so what happened was my wife actually found the business that we're currently in now, which was Just Autos. It was owned by a guy called Justin Lebrano. And that's where it come with Just Autos. It was Justin's Autos, really. And it was a little shop. There was only him and one other apprentice. So we bought that, and it was in a little 100 square meter shed. And we basically, as we took over that shop, we lost half of that, income from that shop overnight, because I wasn't Justin, I was Matt, So a lot of people just didn't want to come to use me, and I kind of lost that. And at the same time, trying to build the business up, I had an apprentice, and I was just kept on pushing forward and going through that. And it was probably, I was doing a fair bit still with petrol, like, LSs and still playing around with all that sort of stuff, because I did enjoy that. But actually had a few too many drinks on eBay one night.
Sounds dangerous.
And this is when eBay was like the thing, like everyone's on eBay. And there was a Nissan Patrol that come up, Common Rail Nissan Patrol, one of the first ones, and it had 900 kilometers on it. And I'm like, man, how bad can it be? It was $12,000. I'm like, man, it'll be sweet. Like, it can't be that bad. It's only a year old,
Yeah, sure.
So I'm like, yeah, boom, I bought it. And anyway, literally the end of the week comes after work Friday, I fly down to Sydney. I pay the dude cash at the airport. Can't see the car, but it's pitch black. I'm like, I don't care. I'm just taking it. Jump in it, drove all the way back home. So it's probably an 8-hour drive. I remember getting home, going to bed, and I probably woke up around 10:30 that morning. I had a few hours sleep, and I looked at the car and I was like, oh my God, it is so bad. It's not funny. Like, just the rust in this car was unbelievable. I've never seen anything like it. And so it was obviously a mine car that was used in a pit to, they idle the car all day long in low range to pull the drag line cable, from what I understand. And they spray salt everywhere, something to do with helping it to bond together or something along those lines. So it was coated in this like grey muck all under this car. So anyway, I was like, I wanted a diesel, because at the time I searched high and low, and the internet was good, but it wasn't as good as it is nowadays. And information about diesels, performance, and there was absolutely nothing that I could get online about how to tune a diesel or what makes a diesel tick. And at that time, forums were quite big, and I would get on forums, and you'd always have the odd engineer or whatever have their 2 cents on how something should be and so forth. But I guess I'm a big believer in you can learn anything from anyone. It doesn't matter your skill set. If you just listen to people, you can learn stuff. And it's something that I was like, I wanted to push in this area, and I wanted to figure out how to make this thing go faster. So I pretty much got to the point where I started to pull apart that car. I, obviously stripped it down, got it all back running again, and I started working on the engine. And because a lot of the components were so rusted out, I had to replace things like turbo manifolds and turbos and all that sort of stuff. And going through there, I knew that at that time, by a lot of the chips that were on the market, because you could buy chips which were interceptors. I could increase the rail pressure of the pump, which would ultimately give me more fuel at the end of the injector, which works pretty simply. But I didn't know where the limit was. Like, no one could explain to me, like, where's the limit? Like, I don't know where that is.
That's always been a tricky one with diesel. I think maybe more so than gasoline. I think maybe, and it sort of comes back to your previous point, there's maybe just a bigger knowledge base out there on the internet with gasoline tuning.
I think it's the feedback you get from a petrol, because you get knock sensors and you get feedback. With a diesel, it's a little bit harder to get feedback.
You get heaps of power and then a melted piston.
Well, yeah, you're like, hey, how do I stop that from happening? Like, where's the point and so forth? So I was adamant and I was prepared to break stuff to learn, because I feel as though for me, that was the only way that I would learn, is by going through that process. So that's what I did. I literally got a Dremel out, and I remember, cutting the suction control valve open, having a look how it works, and then getting another one and modifying that to be able to say, hey, how can I increase more pump pressure here? And I kept going to the point where I would blow the injectors to pieces and the pump, and I replaced the injectors probably 4 or 5 times. I was playing around with different nozzle sizes to try and get more fuel in. And it was a lot of late nights, because I did this around my normal work. So, I'd come in early in the mornings and late at night, and I'd just play around and try and understand. And I got the car to the point, like, I even played with petrol injection into it, a whole lot of different, I had E85 squirting into it. I had a whole lot of range of different things that I was playing with at the time, where I was just trying to get an understanding of how the motor, and believe it or not, that ZD30 never failed. That motor, I threw everything at that thing, nitrous, everything, just trying to understand what works really well and what doesn't. Even water meth injection, I went through just heaps of different things. And it sounds really silly, but for me, it was there was no, like, it's not like you go, oh, how much gains do I get by putting a 100 shot on my diesel? Like, there's just not that there. So I learned pretty quickly diesel was the best thing. Out of everything you put in, diesel's best bang for buck, it works. And by adding bigger nozzles and so forth was giving you, a pretty good increase. I was first going down that road, pulling the injectors apart, changing the needle heights with shim stacks, trying to get more flow out of the injector. But obviously that would only extend the main pulse time. I needed to get more fuel in earlier, so I was missing that window. So the only way you could do that back then was increase pump pressure, so you could get it in front of that. It definitely worked. Like, I think back then we were making close to 280 horsepower on a ZD30, and that's a car that comes out with 120 horsepower. So,
oh wow, that's a huge gain.
I had lots of wacky things going on, like resistors on stuff, and it wasn't pretty. Definitely wasn't pretty, but it worked.
I think maybe this is probably a good time to just pause the trajectory that we're going down here. And maybe if we can just come back a step and let's dive into a little bit of the fundamentals of how a diesel engine works. Because I think our listeners, I know because I came from a gasoline world, and there's a lot of differences when it comes to diesel operation and diesel tuning. So maybe just to sort of fill everything out, we'll pause and go into that. So for a start, if we talk about a gasoline engine, they're referred to as a spark ignition engine, and we have spark plugs. We don't have spark plugs in a diesel engine. These are compression ignition. So could you give us a high-level overview of the combustion process with a common rail diesel engine?
Yeah, well, I guess that's why they call them diesels, because they're dieseling as such. And, when you look at a common rail, it's pretty simple. We usually have, depending on model of car, and this is varied, we usually have a pilot injection, and then maybe 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. Some cars have a lot more than that. And we can have a main injection that comes, and some of them we can have a post injection as well. But
so we're talking about injection pulses here. So a pilot injection pulse and then a main injection pulse. But as you mentioned, particularly with more modern common rails, it may be multiple pulses for our main injection.
Definitely. There's so many variables that happen there. So it's really hard, because I can talk about Toyota, but in general, on some of the Bosch systems, it'll be completely different with how they, control their fueling. But basically, diesels are pretty simple, other than, if you put the fueling in at the right time, you increase the rate of ignition, and you essentially get a bigger bang for buck. And by having that fuel in there, if you can get a larger volume of fuel at that certain time and you have the right air to mix with it, you're going to get more power.
Well, let's just come back one step. So what we're relying on here, diesel typically is going to have quite high compression ratios. We might be talking maybe somewhere in the region of 20-1 or thereabouts.
Yeah, so nowadays a lot of the diesels have come down to around 15-1, and that's because of emissions and smaller capacity engines running higher atmospheres with forced induction and so forth. But yeah, definitely, typically around 18 to 20-1 is what you would see.
So substantially higher than gasoline, and we're relying on that compression to basically create heat. When we compress air, it becomes hotter. That's just physics. And then when we inject the fuel, when the piston is close to TDC, when we've got a lot of heat created in that combustion chamber because of the compression, the heat basically auto-ignites the fuel as it's injected. So that's the premise of diesel combustion, correct?
Pretty much, yeah. And so it's just like an air pump, like a petrol engine. It's now just a matter of increasing the air going in and out as fast as you can. And the most important thing with diesels is understanding how the fueling works with the ignition, with the cylinder pressure and everything else around that, where people with a petrol, obviously you have a point where you can go so far with timing until you start to get detonation, and then you go, righto, cool, this is where we are, say with MBT. Diesels are a little bit different. You can definitely measure that with cylinder pressure, but you'll find that the power will flatline or you'll go backwards in power. So there's some things there where from a feedback point of view, it's really hard to notice without, say, using a dyno or something like that, and doing multiple runs and having multiple stuff to look at.
Okay, let's talk a little bit more about that injection timing, because it's as close as you could liken the ignition timing values in a gasoline engine. So because it's kind of the same thing, when we choose to inject the fuel, it's going to begin combustion very shortly after. So that's what we're controlling here. Could you, for a start, maybe give us some sense of, what would be a typical range of injection timing values when the injection event actually starts? And I guess, obviously, this is going to depend engine to engine. It's going to depend on RPM. So
basically, you're probably really wanting to be ending around 3 degrees after TDC. So depending on just running a main or a pilot within main, you could be up, say, 20 degrees before TDC. But it will vary between that run as well. So it's really hard to go to a one pinpoint. If we talk about one load point, one cell, yeah, definitely, but it is varied. But from the testing that I've done over the years, if you can end your injection around 3 degrees after TDC, that tends to be where you'll get your most efficient burn, your most power in that. The problem is with that is that you're limited then by injector size, because you are now pushed out of that window and you need to get back. So by adding injector nozzles which are larger, you can then close that window back up and you're getting more volume of fuel at that injection timing, which works really well.
So to paraphrase there, we've got a window between the start of injection and the end of injection. Ideally, as you've just mentioned, we maybe want to be finishing the end of injection around about 3 degrees after TDC. So the width of that window is kind of defined, and then it comes down to how much fuel we can actually physically get into the combustion chamber during that window, and that becomes defined by the size of our injector and our fuel rail pressure.
Yeah, definitely. And so the thing is that we see a lot of the problem is fuel pressure is such an important thing. Everyone, there's definitely lots of stuff. People go, oh, running too much rail causes problems with pumps and injectors and that sort of stuff. And yeah, definitely, if you go excessive, you can definitely do damage there. But it's really important to have correct pump control, because if you don't have pump control, then you've got an injection window which will be double, and your end of injection can be 40, 50 degrees after TDC, and that's when you start to get a lot of matter buildup, poor performance, and a whole lot of range of other problems. Your EGTs will be through the roof if that was the case, if you've got no pump control there. Some of the later model cars in our Toyota ranges, in say the Hiluxes and so forth, the pumps are pretty poor. There's only a certain point we can go before we start to have that problem. So that is probably one of our limiting factors on that particular engine. But if we go back to the early stuff, say, for example, into a 1KD, a 2-rotor pump would support so much. But once we go to, say, a 3-rotor pump, which was off a 1VD, which is a V8 cruiser, we could put that into that 4-cylinder and would have, ample amount of pump, and it'll allow us to make a lot more power. So straight away, we can shorten that window, get the right amount of fuel in, and our efficiency goes up, our power goes up, and it all starts that whole cycle again of, tuning that car.
Okay. There's a million things that we need to dive into in a bit more detail here. So let's sort of wind back to one of the terms that we talked about earlier. You mentioned pilot injection and main injection. And this is sort of something that I've seen, I'm not as deep in the diesel world as you are, but I've sort of seen this kind of continually develop to the point, as you mentioned, now there's multiple main injection pulses as well in some ECUs. Can you give us an indication or understanding of what this pilot pulse is there for, and why it's not just let's get all of the fuel in one hit?
Yeah, so there's actually I've read a lot of articles around pilot injection, and the main reason was to do with the dieseling noise from a diesel. They would soften the blow, but if you take away the pilot, done experiments where if you take away the pilot, definitely the diesel's a lot louder, considerably louder. But something that's interesting there also is that we found is that the consumption is worse as well. So there's something happening, and I don't have the science to back that up, but there's definitely something happening with the pilot injection that helps with fuel consumption. And I believe it's probably more to do with your retaining that heat in the combustion chamber. It's helping with ignition because it is start of that pre-ignition. It's not happening later. So, by having that pilot there, it is more efficient. You find that some of the diesel engines, they do drop the pilot and they just go to a main once you get up to higher RPMs and higher load points. But for cruising areas, I have seen articles about saying, hey, the pilot is important for fuel consumption. And I've seen manufacturers play with multiple pulses to be able to try and improve that. It's a bit of an interesting area because definitely it's there for noise. And I think if you were looking at what's a pilot for, noise would be it. But I think there's a little bit more to it than just noise.
It's a little time now since I wrote our diesel fundamentals course with a bunch of helps from some much more experienced people in the diesel world than me. And I got sort of way down in the weeds with that pilot injection at the time. But essentially, if you don't run pilot injection, all of the fuel's just injected simultaneously in one main injection event. There's an ignition delay essentially between the time the fuel is injected and the time it starts to combust. And if you've got all of the required fuel in the cylinder at the same time, we see a very sharp rise in the pressure if we're monitoring in-cylinder pressure as a result. And it's that sharp rise that gives us that diesel knock. And by just injecting a small pulse, what that does is it starts to raise that cylinder pressure and the heat. And the heat's key, as I remember, because then when the main injection pulse begins, the ignition delay is much shorter. Hopefully I haven't completely butchered that, but I think if my memory serves correct, that's the premise behind that pilot injection.
Definitely. So, that's more the technical term of what goes on, without a doubt.
Unfortunately, most of us don't have access to in-cylinder pressure monitoring to see this in action, and I guess at an OE level, they're relying heavily on that to develop the specifics of the mass of fuel that's being delivered and the exact timing, and then the delay between the pilot and then the main injection pulse.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, without a doubt.
Okay, so now we get into the fuel itself. So we've talked about injector size, we've talked about injector nozzles, and we've talked about common rail pressure. So this really sort of comes full cycle to the way we make more power with a diesel engine, which I think a lot of people, again, transferring from the gasoline tuning world to diesel, everything just works backwards. So if I take a gasoline engine that's turbocharged, the way I'm going to make more power with that, I'm going to add more boost to get more air into the engine. I'm going to probably target a leaner air-fuel ratio than stock because almost always the manufacturers use an overly rich air-fuel ratio for safety. Fair. And then probably I'm going to add some ignition timing or ignition advance because, again, in factory form, it's probably going to be conservative. So that's kind of the three levers that I would be pulling to make more power with a gasoline engine. In the diesel world, though, it's a bit different because our air-fuel ratios are lean of stoic. And weirdly, by adding more fuel here, counterintuitive to the gasoline world, by adding more fuel, we get more power, correct?
Yeah, so, that's where all of our energy comes from. It's the fuel. It's as simple as that. So, definitely adding. I think that everyone is so fixated on the AFR or lambda of the actual diesel. And I think people reflect that back to a fuel. So they think, hey, if it's near Stoich and it's blowing out black smoke, it's very rich and that's a lot of fuel. It's actually just showing that there's so much fuel, you're measuring very little oxygen coming through. It's really inefficient. It's not right. But you can still create an air fuel ratio that's close to Stoich and still be clean with no matter coming out the back. And I think that's probably one of the biggest things that people miss, where they think that running a lean air fuel ratio mixture for a diesel, because obviously once you lean them right out, where trucks can run anywhere up up to say 300 to 1 and you lean them extremely lean, the engine will just stop making power and literally stop. I mean, that's how we turn them off at the end of the day. You cut fuel, leans out, stops. However, when we're looking at the air-fuel ratios, something that's really interesting is that people are fixated on a very lean mixture to protect their engine from temperature. And it's not usually the case. There's more in it than that. If you look at OEM, a lot of OEM cars, especially under heavy load, will get down pretty close to Stoich under extreme hot conditions. Definitely when you first hit your foot on the throttle, they might be in the high 20s or something like that. And people think that that's where you need to target to be safe, which is actually not the case. When we start talking about safety of engines and so forth, it's about raising the power with these engines without having excessive engine temperature and oil temperatures increases, because they're the stuff that end up causing issues, I think, for any motor with those problems. We know that diesels can handle a fair bit of power. As far as any diesel from factory form, depending, you could probably get a 30% increase without doing very little mods and still be extremely safe with no problems,
I mean, when you look at the typical internal components of a diesel engine, physically, they're huge, way heavier, way stronger than a typical gasoline engine.
They definitely are built strong. Obviously, compression ratios and, a lot of time, the cars are putting large atmospheres into these engines. So, yeah, there's definitely a lot going on there. What's really interesting, say, for an example, we did some experiments back on when 1KD was first coming through. And that was probably the car that I really broke my teeth on with trying to push and understand. And I'd probably tried 60 different turbo combinations on this car. And I've had different, compound setups and a whole lot of range of stuff that we had sort of fabbed up and made work. And we could run up to 50 pounds of boost in this car, right? But if you don't have the fuel to meet it, you just go lean and nothing really happens. You don't really generate any more power.
That's, again, one of the kind of key differences. I mean, people in the gasoline world, boost is our friend, but we also need to be very mindful of it. It's very much a case of we need to manage carefully what the boost level is to make sure that, we're not running into detonation, we've got enough fuel to keep the engine happy, and that physically we can hold the cylinder head on the engine. The diesel world, though, boost really is our friend, because as we add boost, we're getting more airflow or oxygen into the engine, which then allows us to add more fuel while maintaining a safe air-fuel ratio, correct?
That's right. I think the big issue is probably the biggest problem with adding excessive amounts of boost would be turbo speed and damaging a turbo. That would be the biggest risk. You're not going to, if you have a stock engine and you add double the boost pressure that are coming from factory and the turbo was capable of that, the engine will be completely fine. If you're not adding the fuel in to do that, depending if it's a VNT, yes, you might find that your EMP will go up, obviously, because you don't have the fuel drive to get to that boost level. And what I mean by that, if it's a variable vane turbo, you have to tighten the gap up to get that turbo up to speed to create that boost with no energy, just from the heat from the exhaust. And is that going to do any damage to the motor? No, not from everything that I've seen. Adding that boost pressure, because you don't have the cylinder pressure to go with it, it's just you're adding that pressure there, but you're not making any power from it. It doesn't do anything. Yeah, if you start adding the fuel to go with that, well, yeah, that's a different story.
But again, we sort of come back to the difference that adding the boost without adding the fuel, essentially ending up with a lean air-fuel ratio in the diesel world, is not dangerous where it would be in a gasoline engine.
Exactly right. And so the thing is here, what was interesting is every engine is a little bit different because of efficiencies, and the same goes with petrols. But with diesels, you'll find that different models will require a different nozzle, different spray angles, and you'll find there'll be a different, lambda that they'll run to be efficient at. And the combos are so very important in all that to make it all work well. The Hilux that we had that was compound at the time, we made pretty close to 500 horsepower, and that was in a 3-litre diesel, and I did that as a point to prove at the time to people that everyone was like, no, they'll blow up, the motor will fail.
So am I right in saying here that this is with a stock long motor? You hadn't actually...
The engine was 100% stock. Obviously, it was compound at the time with bigger injectors and a 3-rotor, which is a 1VD pump that I'd modified over the Christmas break to go onto this car. And that was back in the early days. That would have been around probably, I'd say 2010, around that sort of time when I was playing with that. And that car, it made great power. The worst thing about it was the stock manual gearboxes. I was putting in one a week, and that it halted that been pushed any further. But what I did do, I did some testing because I was really fixated on EGTs. And the whole way through, everyone's like, you need to know what the EGTs are, because if the EGTs exceed 600, the engine's going to blow up and it's going to be just a pile of metal. And I was like, it was just something that I was following because everyone said that's what you needed to do.
It's definitely the norm in the diesel tuning world is monitoring EGT, but there's a lot more to it, correct?
100%. And so we at the time had a large pontoon boat, and it wasn't very heavy, but it was big, and it was on a trailer. It was probably maybe 2.5 ton, right? And we were towing it to a dam, and where we are, a lot of big hills. And I thought, look, I'll take the Hilux and I'll go easy on it. But in the big hills in fourth gear and stuff, I'm just going to, try and see where my EGT is. And I'm post-turbo here, so my EGTs are extremely slow in what they're reading.
Let's just touch on that in a little bit more detail. So post-turbo, as you'd expect, the EGT sensor is fitted to the downpipe off the back of the turbocharger. The other place we can put the EGT sensor is pre-turbo in the exhaust manifold. Now, I think this is an important one to mention because it's really easy to see someone quoting EGT numbers on the internet and take that as gospel and go and try and make sure you're tuning to those. The reality is we need to know, well, cool, that number, where was that measured? Because there's quite a significant temperature delta across the turbine wheel. So if we're quoting pre-turbocharger EGT or post-turbocharger, that's a massive difference, and the two are not comparable, correct?
Well, yeah, and this is where I got in the earlier stages of learning about the diesels, I got confused because everyone was in, say, non-direct injection diesels, and it's a lot different to them than, say, a common rail. So they're different engines for different things, but everyone was like, hey, if you exceed 600 EGTs for more than 10 seconds, the piston's going to be on the ground. I'm thinking, oh man, that's crazy, because I'm well above that. You know what I mean? So I tackled and we're going along, so seeing the EGTs, and I was excessively seeing EGTs probably around that 1,000 to 1,100 degrees. Now, that's a lot hotter than what anyone else would say would be right. But there's the reason why that was the case, and that was because my injection that I was spraying was way too long, and I didn't have the pump control. So my injection length was so long that I was ending, probably around that 50, 60 degrees after TDC.
So you're still actually injecting fuel during the power stroke, so it's still creating heat, and then your measured exhaust gas temperature comes up as a result.
And the interesting thing there is that, so in that whole event, I got to the dam, and at the time I was running a VNT into a gated turbo, right? And the actuator is a stainless steel actuator. It had distorted off the turbo, and I couldn't get it back on. Now, the temperature that I was running that whole time was excessive, without a doubt. But I wanted to see, because I was actually trying to melt a piston in my motor. And I know that sounds ludicrous, but I needed to see what was the maximum EGT, because I can't go into starting to tune and do things for customers when I don't even know myself where that limit is. So again, it was something that I couldn't find out and get that information off anywhere. There was no book, there was no anything to say, hey, this is where this motor will go to and why.
Does this all sort of come down to the fact that, we're kind of trying to infer combustion chamber temperature from the exhaust gas temperature, but there's not necessarily a linear correlation between the two, and things like your injection timing, or specifically when the injection event is ending, that's going to have a massive influence on the exhaust gas temperature, skewing that relationship. Am I picking that up about right?
You're right. So the thing is, I think a lot of people go in and they go, it's pretty simple. If you increase power on an engine, you have an increase in heat, because it's the byproduct of it, and you'll find your combustion chamber will be hotter. It's as simple as that. A lot of people I see go in and they go, if the tune is incorrect, the EGTs will be higher because you're just putting in fuel, say by, maybe playing with injector scale table or something along those lines, and it's just in ending fuel way down past TDC. And the problem is that even if you come back to getting it close where the EGTs are normal, the combustion chamber, if you're making more power, still has to be hot. Like, you're not going to get away from that. It's just as simple as what it is. So that's what I was learning by doing those tests, is that I actually, after that event, I brought the car back, and the next Monday morning, I went in and I pulled the whole motor apart, because I wanted to see what damage I'd caused. And I ripped the whole motor apart, laid it out on the bench, and that's when I realized that it was perfect. There was no problems. It was fine. And I put every bearing, every gasket, every single thing back in that motor, and bolted it all back together, put it back in the car, and kept running it, right? And that's actually how I sold the car in the end.
Impressive.
I didn't have the compound on it anymore. I went back to a single turbo because the compound was just too much power, breaking gearboxes and so forth. But that's when I realized that the EGT thing, I think it's a great thing as a guideline. And that's what I say to people. If you want to run an EGT, it's really good to see if you find, hey, every day it runs 350 degrees or whatever it may be, right? And then, but today it's running 450 degrees. Well, you may have something going on where your fuel filter's leaking and your pump pressure's got, bad control, or, and your end of injection starting to happen longer. And all these little things can help you then go, hey, there's something up here because this is abnormal. And it may be able to allow you to catch a problem before it arises. And that's the way that I look at that, because at the end of the day, we really want to see what the temperature is in the combustion chamber. And unfortunately, post-turbo, it happens so slow that you're really reading something that's happened, so long ago, and it's actually not giving you the full story. So for us, a lot of the stuff with running EGTs, we use it in some of our new software for monitoring. So we monitor the EGTs and we know factory where they need to be. And when they start to climb, if there's a problem, we then start to pull fuel out based on that. So we use it for that. And not saying that the EGTs at that temperature, because obviously it's in the exhaust, is going to be melting a piston, because the combustion chamber may be cooler because you've got so much fuel flooding in so past that point that you're not generating any more power. You've got an adverse effect and your combustion chamber is cooler.
Okay. I've got a question here just regards to power EGT and air fuel ratio. So, if we have the amount of fuel being injected required for let's say it's an arbitrary number of 500 horsepower, and we're using a turbocharger that's nice and safe at whatever boost pressure we decide to use, and we're achieving that horsepower at let's say 20 psi of boost pressure, whatever mass airflow that results in. It doesn't really matter, arbitrary numbers. That's going to result in an EGT, whatever that may be. Could we then, assuming that this turbocharger is still able to move more air, could we leave our injection fuel mass as it is, increase our boost pressure from, let's say, 20 to 40 psi, moving more air? Let's just say magically that's now moving double the amount of air. Obviously, by definition, then our air-fuel ratio is going to become leaner. How does that affect the power that we're making, given that we are still injecting exactly the same mass of fuel? How does that affect the power that we're making in our EGT? Basically, are we going to end up with similar power, but with a much safer calibration?
That's a really good question, because again, it depends on the engine and the efficiency of that. So you might find you'll be able to increase the boost pressure and at a leaner air-fuel ratio. And it may be purely because of the point you have better pump control or less injection. But when you're adding the boost pressure, you'll find that one thing that you are increasing is your exhaust manifold back pressure as well to drive that turbo.
Of course. Yeah, that's a good point. Let's just say that this is a magic turbo and we don't actually have any negative effect on our EMAP. So yeah, obviously not realistic in one shape or other, but let's just assume that magical turbo exists. So I know I've got you really on the ropes here.
The way that I would look at that is say that it's hard to say what is safe and what is not safe. I think that's the question you're trying to ask, is saying by just adding a air-fuel ratio that's leaner, if the EGTs are low, if there's less heat, well then, yeah, overall, if there's less heat in the combustion chamber, it'll be safer, okay? That's just a given. I think where you talk about load, there's something that we do also is that when a lot of late model cars, they have a higher boost pressure when they're running with a lean air-fuel ratio at light load. And that's something that if we reduce down the boost pressures in those areas, we find we get a lot better consumption. And I put that down to we're still having that load on the engine. The engine's still having to push that atmosphere of air, and we're not generating any power from that. So that there still has to be some parasitic loss with doing that.
Yeah, that makes sense. The turbocharger is running off exhaust gas energy, but there's still no completely free lunch.
That's right. So by reducing that, it's not even about the fueling at that stage anymore. We're now talking, hey, we need to take the load off the engine. We know we can make, say, 200 newton meters with that engine with zero boost, So why don't we drop the boost down in that area? And that's how we get it. Yes, the downside would be your emissions would be higher, wouldn't be as good. So I know manufacturers are doing, higher boost levels, leaner air-fuel ratios to try and get that for an emission-based view. But so when tuning, that's one thing that we're looking at, is that there's the overall view of trying to make an engine that's safe and that, basically is efficient without having a lot of matter. Because the last thing you want to do is tune a diesel where you've got a smoky diesel, because Smoky diesels, I don't like it. It's not my thing. Like, especially when we're tuning our land mobile cars, we want to see that the fact that they're clean as a whistle. We don't really want any matter coming out. It shows us that we have good control over our pump and our fuel control by doing so. And then we want to try and reduce that boost pressure down around those cruisy areas to try and get efficiency with fuel consumption.
Sure. Okay, so again, a bunch of things that come out of that. I think your point about a clean tune, I 100% agree. And I think it's kind of, we've all seen drag diesel or tractor pulls or whatever with just huge clouds of black smoke, can't see the sky anymore. And I kind of feel like in general, there's sort of a slow trend towards moving away from that in the diesel performance market and trying to create cleaner tunes. Of course, if we've got emissions devices that are mandated, such as DPFs, you have to be careful, because if you create a very dirty tune, all you're going to end up doing is clogging up your DPF every week.
For sure, without a doubt. Look, it's always confusing when you see a lot of certain cars around the world and they're pluming out smoke, and I don't understand that. It just shows me that there's poor control in those areas.
Yeah. I think a lot of people, I don't know if it's so much the same these days, but the rolling coal used to be a bit of a badge of honor. And I mean, particularly if you're in a country where the emission standards are very strict. I'll use the US here, the EPA. There's no secret. They're obviously been targeting a lot of tuning shops. You create dirty tunes like that, and you're literally just asking for a massive fine. So makes no sense in my opinion.
No, definitely not.
All right, so I want to come back one step and talk a little bit more about the fuel pressure, fuel control. So we've got very, very high rail pressures for our fueling in a common rail diesel compared to what we might be used to in a port injected gasoline engine, where it might be 45 psi. Now obviously the actual pressure is going to be dependent on the specific engine and also load and RPM, but could you give us kind of a ballpark figure, like what's typical numbers for common rail diesel fuel pressure?
So like 205,000 kPa, say, for a V8 Cruiser, and one of the earlier stuff can go all the way up to, say, 285 nowadays, and some of the later stuff. So they're definitely a lot higher. And when we start looking at sort of pressures there, they're definitely excessive. However, they are gaining more efficiency by doing so as well. On a lot of the later model cars, we don't have to put the rail pressure any higher. We actually have enough pressure and enough headroom with the injector we're using. The injectors seem to be a lot quicker than what we were using with, say, inductives. And you have the ability then to use just even the factory pressure to be able to get the power that you're after.
Because that was always sort of, one of the first levers that you pull in a diesel is just raise the fuel pressure target. So for a given pulse width, we're just physically injecting a larger mass of fuel into the engine, and that gives us the benefit. We don't have to start moving around our injection timing. We can leave that where it is. But obviously there's a limit to that. Just while you were talking there, I quickly Googled it because I can't do this in my head, but that 200,000 kPa, I think equates to, if I've done that right, 29,000, so 30,000 psi, just again, so we can compare those numbers directly.
They're high numbers, and this is something that I experimented with. It's a high pressure system, but low volume. That's the thing that's really important to understand about common rail. It pumps very, very high pressure. And, some of the cars, everyone thinks about you having to increase. There's areas in the tables that we're decreasing pressure, not increasing. But again, that comes down to how we're tuning and the reasons why around that, and, to do with consumption and so forth.
So let's just talk a little bit about that, because it's not always a case of more is better. Obviously, if we're at wide open throttle asking for everything the engine can produce, and we need to get more fuel into the engine, then maybe under those conditions, increasing the fuel pressure might make sense. But in the cruise areas where we want this efficiency, fuel economy, it comes down to the fact that there is a loss associated with driving that fuel pump harder and making more fuel pressure. So is that where you're sort of going to?
That's right. So parasitic loss around that by having too high a pressure. Again, because we're not chasing emissions here, we can get away from that and reduce that down. Also, when you're starting to open the injector, you might have the issue where the pump can't physically keep up at a certain point. So to have your PID control going crazy, trying to catch its tail as you open the injector, you're better off, bringing that down those areas where it's more achievable for it to be able to be met. So you've got a more relaxed PID control around that, because sometimes you're just working with the physical limitations of a mechanical pump. It just can't supply the fuel and the pressure you want at that RPM. It needs to spin either harder, or you need to produce a larger pump, or you bring back that window. There's not too many options you can deal with, especially on the pump side, to be able to control that. And it's really important to have good pump control, because that means that if you have good pump control, you've got good fuel control, and that's where you pick up all the other things along the way with it.
Okay. Now, one of the things you sort of hear is a bit of a horror story, and maybe this is more associated with some of the US domestic market trucks, sort of Ford, GM, and Dodge. But the fuel system is very delicate. It's running at excessive pressures, which we've just mentioned, and you hear horror stories about the pumps failing, or the injectors failing, and basically the whole system needs to be replaced at huge cost. How much of a real concern is this? Is this down to limitations on the parts even in stock form, or people pushing them too hard in the aftermarket?
This is something that's a perfect thing to probably talk about. Would be a few years ago, we started to realize when there was a seed of doubt in the market, and everyone was like, hey, if you don't put a secondary fuel filter on your car, you're going to have dirty fuel, and your fuel system's thousands to replace. And it started this chain of event where every company got on board, and they're like, you just need this, and they were putting 5 micron filters on these cars, and factory was around 12. And we started to notice when we were analysing data, we were going through it, and we started to see that the pumps were starting to struggle between models of cars. And it was just getting worse and worse. And, we were pulling off fuel filter kits, and the hole sizes were only like 6 mil, like they just hadn't been drilled out. And then the filters are 5 microns. And we couldn't really understand at the time why this was the case. We thought, okay, there's a problem here. And it wasn't until we started having a look at it, and we were running clear line from, a lot of the filters back to the pump, checking for air and stuff like that to make sure they weren't leaking air. And what we found is that the pumps were having a lot of cavitation, right? And straight away, we're like, hey, this is a problem. So if we were to remove, say, a secondary fuel filter and get rid of it completely, it would reduce our cavitation by a considerable amount, right? We would see that there would be minimal cavitation there. The only way to get rid of all of it was actually to get rid of the factory filter altogether, and you would get rid of the cavitation. So straight away, we knew that this was a concern. And when we started to do more research into cavitation for diesels, I actually found some documentation in America that there was some essays written around diesel system failures and what causes them. And the study ended up concluding that the leading cause of diesel system failures is actually cavitation, and, not foreign matter. And I thought that was interesting in itself. And it's so funny, by adding a filtration system to resolve this dirty fuel that you get in your tank, you're actually causing cavitation, right?
So you're creating more trouble than you're fixing.
And we started to see this, and that's when, if you start looking at shops, you'll start to see under the microscope on a lot of the diesel system components, you'll see pitting. And it's funny, you go, well, how does that pit? If there's no water in the system, how are you getting pitting in those components? And it has to be through cavitation.
So the cavitation creates tiny little air bubbles in the fuel, and it's that's doing the pitting?
Yeah, super hot, and they gouge little bits of metal out. And guess where that metal goes? It's not like it's going out the back, it's going back into those injectors. And then before you know it, now you've got pump problems and injector problems that, injectors only lasting 150,000 Ks. And here you go, you got a customer that went, oh, well, I fitted a secondary fuel filter to stop this from happening. Do you know what I mean? Well, unfortunately, by doing that, you've ended up with this result, and here you are. Now, obviously, the models are different, but some models of cars have like pre-pumps in the tanks that prime the common rail, which will help with that. But there's a lot of them that don't. They have a gear-driven pump on the back of them, but the cavitation is so high. The other thing that cavitation causes is that now the fuel temperature is going up. So you've got the issue with fuel temp going up, and you have like this exacerbating problem that starts to arrive from it. So when we see a car come in, before we do any car, we do pre-dyno inspections on them, and that's one of the biggest things that we give back to the customer in a bag. We say, here's your secondary fuel filter, or if the fuel filter, the system itself is set up as a pre-filter, we'll change it to a 30 micron, so we know that, hey, there's really no effect that has on this system. The problem is with that, is it doing anything? Probably not, because your factory one's going to do majority of the work. So we believe in those situations, less is more. In the fact, if you're changing your factory filter regularly, we believe that's the best way moving forward. And if they're cheap enough to buy, I would be doing it every service. It's not a huge thing. It's easy to do. And that way we're minimizing that problem. It's funny when you look into a truck, for example, and the common rail trucks, you see them do 500, 600, nearly a million Ks on a set of injectors. And you go, how's that possible when they're just bigger? That's all they are. They're no different. They're just bigger. Yes, trucks are continually moving on the road. So we know that when a common rail sits for long periods of time, the sulfur that's in our diesel definitely does have a corrosive effect on those injectors and those components, and they seem to not last very long with sitting around. So if you have a car that sits in your shed for 2 weeks at a time and you maybe use it half a dozen times in a year, you might have a car that's got 30,000 Ks on it and it needs a set of injectors, and people are going, how does this make any sense? So you definitely have different scenarios around injector failures and what we see and why we replace them. But definitely when we start talking about, pumps and diesel system failures, I would say that the secondary fuel filter is probably a big one. And it's something that we're quite passionate about. So every car that comes in, I won't tune a car if it's got a 5 micron filter on it. I'll be like, even if they want them, so I'm sorry guys, I'm not doing it, because it's just the repercussions and it makes our job harder to do. We only put best foot forward. So
I think the problem as a tuner as well is you're the last person to touch the football, and when it goes wrong, of course the fingers start getting pointed back at the last person. So yeah, that makes sense. I think from a reputation standpoint, it's really important in the tuning industry. You have to take precautions to protect that reputation, because it's very, very difficult to build up and it's very, very easy to lose. So yeah, I totally get that. I just wanted to interrupt our interview with Matt and talk about a package of courses that are going to be perfect for anyone who wants to learn more about diesel engine tuning, and that is our Ultimate Diesel Tuning Package, normally valued at $299 US. You can use the coupon code JUST50. It'll take $50 off the purchase price, bring it down to just $249 US. This package includes our Diesel Tuning Fundamentals course, which covers the core tuning principles and operating principles of a common rail diesel engine. As I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, the operating principles of a compression ignition diesel engine are significantly different to a conventional gasoline engine. And importantly, the tuning principles and the way we approach tuning with fuel, boost, and injection timing are also very, very different. Without this information, it's going to be very difficult to get the most out of your diesel engine, or at least to do it safely. Once you understand the tuning principles, we then move into the practical diesel tuning course, which takes what we've learned in our fundamentals course and then expands it, looking at how we can apply these while we're actually tuning a diesel engine. This is a generic course, so it doesn't matter what diesel engine you're tuning, the principles remain the same. Once you've learned the tuning process, we know it can still be daunting when it comes to tuning your first diesel engine. So within this course, we've broken the entire tuning process down into the HPA 5-step process. By doing this, each of the individual steps are relatively quick and easy to complete. And in no time, you've got to the end, you've got a completely tuned engine that's going to be delivering great power, great torque, great reliability, and a nice clean tailpipe. The course is broken into 2 parts. The body of the course teaches you the tuning process and the 5-step process. And then from there, we move into our library of worked examples, which is where we follow an informal walkthrough of the 5-step process being applied on a real tuning job. Here, we vary the type of engine that we're tuning as well as the software we're using, so you can get experience on a wide range of different platforms. This package also includes 24 months of gold membership, which gives you access to our private members-only forum. This is the best place to get reliable and trustworthy answers to your specific tuning questions. You'll also get access to our regular weekly live webinars. And if you can't watch live, then you can rewatch our webinars in our archive, where we've got 350 hours of content at the moment. This is one of the fastest ways to expand your knowledge on a huge range of performance automotive topics. Remember, that package deal, just $249 US using the coupon code JUST50. You can still break that down into as many as 8 individual weekly payments to make it as affordable and as achievable as we can. You are also still protected with our 60-day no questions asked money back guarantee, so there is zero risk. If you don't like what you see, let us know. We'll give you a full refund of the purchase price. You will find that coupon code in the show notes as well. Now, let's get back to our interview with Matt. Now, I'd like to get some sort of idea on what's achievable. So what I'm going to let you do, because obviously this is completely dependent on the particular vehicle that you're tuning. But if we take your favorite vehicle that you can choose, and we'll talk about what that is in a second, in 100% stock format, so no hardware modifications at all, could you give us an indication of what power that made off the showroom floor, maybe on your dyno, and then with tuning alone, what you can actually safely achieve out of it?
Yeah, so at the moment, I'm pretty heavily in the later stuff, which is 300 series. That's probably the car that I'm spending a lot of time on. And it's a car that I personally drive every day. You know, between me and Matt and Josh working through these cars, we soon found out that this motor is really efficient, makes really good power, and can do it really, really well. And it's surprising how good it is. You know, we can expect to see, upwards of 100 horsepower gain in this car. And I know it sounds pretty crazy. You go, wow, that's pretty cool.
What are we talking in stock form, just so we can see that as a kind of a percentage gain?
In all four wheels, say on the dyno, you'll be around that 185 horsepower and you get pretty close to that 300 horsepower.
Wow.
So it's definitely a big difference. On the turbocharger side, anywhere we're running from that 28 pound in a factory form all the way up to 38 pound. It's amazing being a sequential turbo setup that the turbos can actually still have enough air to flow in that area, in that range. And I have enough fuel in the stock form to be able to supply the power for that as well. And so my window was still there. And it's actually, we pushed that in our own test car beyond that. We had it on a hub dyno. So obviously those numbers are different. So I can't give you what they would be on the rollers. But on a hub dyno, we got up to 442 horsepower on that stock frame motor, running around 42 pounds of boost. And it was clean as a whistle, like no smoke coming out the back, clean as a whistle. And that car was extremely quick for what it was. They're still running to this day. I'll move that car on. I've got another one, but we're continually turning them over every 6 months or so, doing development on them. And that car, it's amazing the power that delivered. And you think it's hard for people to understand unless you've driven that car. It's really hard to come here and actually understand what we're sort of talking about now. When we start talking about temperatures, the great thing about that particular car is because when I towed, I actually didn't have to use all that power because being sequential, that was all that power left up to the top red range when they're both turbos on. But towing, I'm only using one turbo and in all that range. So it's nearly like having two tunes with two different setups.
I'm glad that you just mentioned that with towing, because I think this is one of the areas of tuning that is quite unique or quite specific to diesel versus gasoline. Obviously, a lot of diesel pickup trucks are used for towing heavy loads, so we're dealing with a different market. Where I'm going with this is a calibration that's going to be safe in a vehicle that isn't towing huge loads up a steep hill could be quite different to what we would need to do in order to make that safe, towing, a 3.5, 4,000 kilogram trailer up a steep incline. The engine's physically working a lot harder doing that, so we start to see the EGT climb. If we take away from the vehicle that you're just talking about with the sequential setup, which seems ideally suited to that, traditionally, how do you walk that sort of fine line or tightrope of deciding how far you can push an engine based on the way it's going to be used?
I guess it comes down to the temperature and watching the temperature stabilize and working out where that is. And that's something that, I'm always concentrating on, coolant temp. Like I know a lot of people probably don't tend to look at that so much, but it gives you a really good indication of the overall temperature of the engine and how hot it's getting. And you want to make sure that you're not getting excessively hot where you're going to get to the point where the engine's going to start to overheat and then you're going to do more damage with that engine. Things like oil temp, stuff like that are very important as well. But definitely once you start towing, we tow with extremely heavy load. We're actually probably all the time overweight with what we are towing. Or when we're doing our dyno stuff, we will do simulations for around 18 minutes. And if you've ever seen a dyno at that load, they're glowing red hot and the smoke coming out the dyno, not the car. You know what I mean? Like it's not really great for it. But what we're doing, we're trying to get to a point where you're looking at all the temperatures and you're getting them to stabilize at one point. If you keep on adding power, obviously they slowly start to climb. They just keep climbing. So you need to get to that point where in factory form, you can see what it is. And you can get to the point where you can mimic where factory is with a lot of those temperatures by setting up the car with more power, because we have other things like our EGTs in our protections where once we get to a certain point, we pull fuel out at that point. So
you've got those safety systems there. You don't have to rely on the driver actually understanding what's happening and getting out of the throttle or, doing something to safeguard it.
That's right. So if you think of it like this, that the car has more power everywhere, but eventually those two lines from a standard form and a tow tune will meet at one point. And where that point will meet will be when the car's got to a certain temperature. They're meeting at that same point where we're saying, hey, now we've pulled that power down to here to, maintain that temperature for that period of time. Because a lot of the thing is that it takes some time to get to that temperature. You might find you'll have to do a climb for maybe 5 kilometers or so before you get to that point where, in that form, majority of the time we're driving on flat roads or whatever we're doing, we really want that power to get up and moving. Or if you're merging onto a highway, you just don't have that time to get that heat into that engine to be there a problem, that sustained heat for a long period of time. So that's something that we're always closely monitoring with that. Something that's big at the moment that we're looking at is oil quality. They're running 020s and we've changed that now to, 540s and so forth with higher shear rating oils. And that's something that we're spending a fair bit of time at the moment monitoring oil temperatures and where the oil starts to degrade at. We know that, getting into the high 30s, the oil just turns and it's no good. But we're looking at developing oils that can help with that for long sustained drives, and that's something that is happening at the moment as well. So
okay. Now, in terms of instrumentation, so what a tuned diesel owner could add to the vehicle in order to help safeguard. Now, you've mentioned oil temperature and coolant temperature. Traditionally, most vehicles don't come from the factory with an oil temperature, readout. I'm always very cautious of how much notice I take of engine coolant temperature as well. The number of cars I've had on a dyno with an aftermarket ECU where I can visually see the temperature in degrees, and every half a degree it changes, and you sort of see how that relates to the temperature gauge on the dash, and probably from about 50 degrees C through to 105 it's bang in the middle, and you're like, yeah, happy days, we're good. And you go over 105 and all of a sudden it shoots up. So it's not real granular, you're not got a lot of resolution. So we can add other ways of displaying that data. And then I guess the other one I'm interested in, we've talked already about EGT. Is that something you'd recommend adding? And then we've already touched on Lambda. Obviously from the gas world, I live and die by Lambda. A little less relevant, maybe a lot less relevant in the diesel world. But yeah, out of those four, what are the key ones? What should we be adding?
I'm not, if someone comes to me and says, I want this, that's my job to make sure that you don't have to look at those things, right?
Totally fair too.
I don't believe in the gauges and all of them, because the factory of the ECU, the way that it's set up, what we have in our software nowadays, we have things like we will flash the engine light at you if you exceed 105 degrees. It tells you, hey, mate, you're starting to get hot. So we don't turn the car off. We don't, we have a reduction of power coming in with that, but we're letting you know that, hey, the hill that you're doing on the 40-degree day with your 4.5 ton on the back, the engine light's flashing at you, that you're like, hey, I'm aware that I'm pushing it. So, you can change your driving style to suit and reduce those temperatures down, maybe just pull over, have a break, and you drive to the conditions. When we start adding more gauges, I think the problem is that the reason why the actual Toyota gauges are the way they are, and you'll find that people go, mate, it's never moved off quarter its whole life. Well, it's not the case. It actually, if you look at what the temperature is doing, every hill it goes up, and the way that they set up those gauges in, last 3 degrees getting from 108 to say 112, the gauge will move from halfway to hot, like pretty quickly. But they have that variation of, 10 degrees down in that bottom section where it can move up and down without the gauge moving, because we can imagine if we gave that to a customer where you could see it, they'd go, mate, the gauge is going like this all day. We've got problems.
They need to dumb it down for the 85th percentile car owner.
100%. And I believe with the technology nowadays, we just don't need to have those gauges. I think you definitely get people, and especially guys that say truck drivers or being in earth moving machinery, and they're monitoring those gauges on it, and they want that. There's a lot of scan gauges you can buy nowadays that plug in. Part of our EasyTune, we give all the PIDs that come out of the ECU, which is the data that represents, coolant temp and all those things. And you can pull that out and see that in live time as well. But again, when I drive a car, I'm not looking at gauges.
No.
I just drive it. I put the caravan on, I tow with it, I do what I need to do, because I need to simulate what our customers would be doing. And I don't want them to be worried about their holiday where they're staring at these gauges and then they're sitting there on their phone at night going, how many degrees should this be or that be? Because then it starts this problem where you're like, hey, it's full normal what it's going through. That's why I don't recommend gauges. Years ago, I used to. I 100% used to, but I just changed the way that I drove I put myself in their shoes and went, hey, this is our job. This is what we're supposed to be doing. I would rather you guys with not having to worry. And if there's lights come up on the dash, we've got some problem and we'll deal with it then. And I think that's the best way to do any of that sort of stuff with those cars.
Okay, cool. All right, let's just move on a little bit, and I want to talk about some of the hardware modifications that we can add to a diesel. So we've already talked about the fuel system in terms of bigger pumps and bigger injectors or nozzles. Safe to assume that the diesel engine is going to respond favourably to the similar sort of modifications we'd make in a gasoline engine, such as a larger turbo to get more massive air into the engine, an intercooler upgrade to cool that air down, and freer flowing exhaust, all of the same sort of things we'd change on a gasoline engine.
The diesel engine, again, it's an air pump. So yeah, you're 100% right. Increasing, your turbos and so forth, exhaust, intakes, all that sort of stuff definitely does help in the same way. I think it's just the combustion side, the fueling that we're using and the way that we're controlling that is obviously different. But at the end of the day, yeah, it is an air pump, and it's all about getting that air in and out as quick as possible. And that all helps. It's just different. That's all it is. It's similar, but it's just different,
Yeah. When it comes to turbo upgrades, I'm interested in your take on this. I've gone through this sort of experience myself when we were developing our diesel tuning courses, and we were dealing with a Hilux 1KD turbo engine at the time, and quickly found out that those turbos are incredibly fragile, and a significant increase in, well, not even a significant increase in boost was enough to sort of have the shaft fail. We ended up with an aftermarket turbo. I can't remember who supplied that, and it probably would have been great if we wanted to drag race this pickup truck, but it just killed everything below about 3,000 RPM. And of course, with a diesel, one of the other things is typically, there's no sort of hard and fast rules on this, but typically they rev much lower than a gasoline engine. Sort of 4,500 RPM would be pretty typical. So yeah, what do we need to know about sizing turbochargers for a diesel engine that's a street engine, not a drag car?
Well, a lot of the time, it depends on what the customer is wanting, but what we offer, we're definitely wanting, factory-like response out of the car when you drive the car, and that's even static response, but also to build that torque as early as possible without causing any damage. And that's something that we have to be mindful of, is that, there's definitely turbochargers we can put in, 3 times the amount of boost than what factory has at, say, 1,500 RPM. You've got to be very careful doing that because your cylinder pressure will be very high, your motor's not burning, very similar to a petrol car. If you want to punch it right out the side of the block, that's where you'll do it. I'm big on VNT turbos. I think the VNT turbos are great for diesels because they give us that wider window because our rev range is so short to start with.
Well, yeah, let's talk about that, because VNT turbos sort of tend to go hand in hand with common rail diesels. We don't see them sort of really that much in the gasoline market. Normally we're going to be using a turbocharger just with a wastegate. So why do they work so well with a diesel engine? Why are they so popular?
I think it's because if you go to a gated turbo, you're sacrificing something, you know what I mean? Either bottom end for top end and vice versa. It's pretty hard to get a turbocharger to fill that torque curve in that window as long as possible. And then VNT does that really well. It gives you a broader torque curve for a longer period of time over, say, a gated turbo. Some of the gated turbos, yes, depending again on sizing, will make a lot more power, but you lose that bottom end, where a VNT, you'll find that you can hold a torque curve for a lot longer. You have to be very careful with VNT because you can definitely make any of those turbos produce a lot of boost, and you need to make sure that your control system around that is spot on and your duty tables and your PIDs, controlling that is right, because it's not like a gated turbo where you say run 20 pound for the whole period of the run. You might have a peak at around 1,500 RPM or 2,000 RPM where your peak boost will be. By the end of your run at, say, 4,000 RPM, you're rolling that down to, say, 12 pound to keep shaft speed in check. And that's something that's a little bit different with, say, doing it to a gated turbo on a petrol variation. And that is to try and also keep EMP in check, but also the main thing there is that we don't want the turbo to leave the planet, and understand that about our torque curve, we're trying to keep our torque curve as flat as possible for as long as possible, And diesels, majority of people that drive diesels, we don't race the car. It's not designed for that. But we're using that torque curve where we're changing in 2,000 RPM increments. So, you get the car up to 2.5 grand, changing gears, and that's sort of the area that a lot of people tend to drive. You may find also a lot of older guys, they tend to lug their diesels where they're lugging them very low RPM like a truck. And, you need a turbocharger that's suitable for that as well. Obviously going to the 1KD situation and putting, say, an aftermarket turbo on that has a lot more power, yeah, that's great. But you actually don't realize if the turbo comes on, anything from 2800 onwards, you've got no bandwidth for power. You're literally, it's on and it's off, and unfortunately it's not until you get in, say, fourth or fifth gear that you can utilize some of that for a bit longer, and it makes for a poor driving experience. And
well, that turbocharger on our in-house test vehicle destroyed it. It was just absolutely horrible, complete pig to drive. So yeah, I of all people know that turbo selection is absolutely critical to the usefulness of a vehicle. We were stepping a little bit into the unknown with this particular application, and unfortunately the one we chose was a really poor choice. Just coming back to that VNT, so variable nozzle turbine, people can, if they don't know what that is, are going to have to Google it because it's really hard to explain, but essentially a set of vanes around the turbine wheel that can be moved while the engine's running. So am I right in saying here essentially what this allows us to do is make the turbocharger act like it has a very, very tight AR on the exhaust housing at low RPM, so providing essentially more exhaust gas energy to spool that turbocharger, but then those vanes can open up and act like a larger AR housing at once we've got boost.
Yeah, definitely. That's exactly how it works. I like to look at it like a paintbrush roller when you're cleaning a paintbrush roller, and you've got the water going in the center. Then as it gets going, you move it to the outside and you gain more momentum from it. The thing is, a variable vane, there's a little bit of a fine art to setting them up and getting them work correctly. You got to be very careful where if it's an aftermarket turbo, the base vane position, which is what I'm talking about, is that if the vanes are all the way closed, you will get no airflow through that turbo. So you got to be careful with setting that gap and understanding where that needs to be, and also tuning around that. It's not so much having the base position, but tuning to what the car and application needs. If you go too tight, you'll find that you'll overstuff, and you'll start to have a lot of dieseling noise, lack of response, poor drivability, all those things. And you can actually get more response by opening it up and not having such a tighter gap and all those sorts of things in between. So it's gated turbos. I think there's a place for gated turbos. I think there's some very good gated turbos you can buy. I think from a tuning point of view, it's extremely easy. You put the turbocharger on, you set the gate up, you put a T-bleed on it, whatever you decide to do. Once that's done, there's nothing else to do there. You literally just concentrate on fuel control and you're done. Unfortunately, with VNT, majority of our job is actually setting up base VNT, because you will find that every single car that we tune, and 79 series are probably more for this, is they're so different. People think you get the one car and the next one's going to be exactly the same, and it's surprisingly how different they are. And there's so many variables in that, because that control systems they use a vacuum control system, and unfortunately, with the latency in it and some of the issues with the setup of the turbos, you'll find there's variations that to get the car to perform at that level and be right, you need to, custom tune that vehicle. You need to put the effort into it to make it right. And I think that's what a lot of people forget, that they go, oh, I've got one file that works in every car. Well, it's not that case. We may have the fueling that will be correct, or the pump control that will be correct, but we always have to seem to adjust our base duties and our pit control around that car to suit that. And it's amazing once you start diving very deep. And it's something that we have that EasyTune's given us, is our data logging speed. And now we're starting to see the holes that we have over the years. And when you go, okay, well, now we've got the speed to see this, we can see, hey, we can adjust the base tables to suit, and we're getting better with our tuning as the information that we're receiving is better. Every car gets put through that pace. And, in generalized, you'll find that any control system will help you get on top of it, and it'll carry you. But if you spend the effort and go through that process and get it right, it makes the car drive so much more better. You've got that drivability, and I think that's what people are paying us for, and that's why we spend that effort on going down that road and doing that. And it's hard to explain that to a customer or to people that are coming in with these cars, because it's something that we live in. That's what we live in every day. And I know there's, plenty of other places that just rely on a file to put in and it'll be 80% and that's good enough, but we're striving for more than that. And that's something that, we want.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. It's probably a good segue into talking about the other part of this puzzle, which is, of course, the tuning. And we've touched on some of these aspects already. I'm interested, one of the things with Toyota as a manufacturer is they haven't traditionally been particularly user-friendly or well-supported in terms of aftermarket reflash tuning support for their ECUs. Why is that? How much of a problem is it? And clearly you've got around that issue. So how have you managed to do so?
Man, I'd love to know the answer to that. I can't honestly say why Toyota are different. It's something that, a lot of manufacturers with Tricors and a lot of the Bosch stuff and Siemens, and there's a lot of information overseas where it seems to be possibly the engineers that worked on some of the setup in those earlier days maybe have loose lips. I'm not too sure exactly how that information gets out, but it's out there for a lot of the public to be able to go through. From an engineering point of view, they can get that information and they can make way with it very quickly. Unfortunately for Denso, for us, we don't have any of that. We don't have that accessibility. So we literally have to do it the hard way where you're decompiling. And this is something that my business partner, Matt in EasyTune, that's what he's doing on a daily basis. And that is how we're getting, information. Unfortunately, like I was saying, it's just a very slow process in doing that. And we wanted to tackle Toyota because it is a great selling car, but it's a great platform to start with. It's a very reliable platform and it's hard to do. And we feel as though if we do the hard stuff, we'll be better for it by doing that.
I think probably another sort of knock-on effect of dealing with the hard stuff is that it probably puts you into a market with not as many competitors. I wouldn't say none, but if there's low-hanging fruit, it's really easy to tune a particular vehicle. Well, any man and his dog can sort of jump on board and start supporting that platform. When there's a whole bunch of barriers to entry in the way, it kind of naturally filters out those who can and those who can't.
Yeah, definitely. I think I remember when I first started getting into understanding, because I was, doing a lot of the stuff with, HKS modules back in the day and, interceptors and chips and so forth. And then to get into the engine ECUs and go down that way, there's just a lot of barriers and there's a lot of things you have to work through. It's not as simple as what people, or we make it look out to be. You plug in and away you go. And getting extremely hard to do what we do nowadays. The newer cars that are coming out with ECUs, the complexity of stuff, reverse engineering is becoming more difficult. We have systems in place because obviously we've learned a lot from the previous models, but a lot of that stuff doesn't go into the later models. You know what I mean? Some of the core fundamentals do, but it's always evolving, and security and everything else around it is just getting more complex. And that's something that, we're continually chipping away at and working through. But yeah, overall, I think the industry that we're in, I would say it's a pretty small network of people around the world that are actually in this sort of niche. To go to a point of decompiling and doing something and actually having then tuning as well that's involved in that, it's sort of like two different sections. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not a computer engineer, but, I've got the tuning side, but then you need to merge both of them to be able to make a product work.
So just for a bit of clarity here, EasyTune, maybe it's worth just very briefly touching on what that is. Is this a commercial reflash platform like EFI Live HP Tuners, for example, where you're able to download the factory calibration via OBD2 and then visually see the different maps in a way that makes sense to us as a tuner? Or are you using that in conjunction with something like WinOLS, where you're actually finding and defining the calibration yourself, and EasyTuners are a platform for read and write?
Yeah, it's a little bit different to say HP Tuners and so forth, which is a platform that provides an editor. At the moment, our platform, we're using it in our testing phase where we go through Just Autos and our distributors. We're basically got a portal for them. They can purchase the file, upload the actual data logs to our server so we can monitor that and make revisions from. But also it's got things like OBD functions in there for certain functionality to control with the ECU. It's got, we have a live tuning option there, which is something that hasn't been done in these ECUs before. We can have that plugged back into OLS as a trace as well, which is obviously an editor that we use to be able to make this. So we start off in OLS to make these maps up. We do have an editor that's online in that platform in EasyTune. It's something that we haven't released to the public, or we don't actually use ourselves because we're so used to using things like OLS. But as we progress forward with hardware and so forth, that will tend to evolve and it'll be a little bit different to what it is today. But right now, our distributor base is using that on a daily basis, and it's something that is very accessible, very easy for us to use. And those customers, we're able to double check their work and make sure it's right instead of just emailing out a file to someone, loading in the car and leaving it. The fact that they can then data log that car, send that data log to us like in instant time, it comes up on my screen. I get to see everything. And we spend a lot of time on the logging set. We're hijacking things like the car's lambda sensor so we can read AFR, because that sensor's there only for DPF regens. It's not there to monitor, lambda in any way. So, we've got a really powerful sensor there that we actually turn on and we use while we're tuning and stuff like that, so we can understand what's going on. So the log set that we get back is better than what we can get from OEM, and it's best than we've ever had out of any platform. So that's something that's extremely powerful for us.
So to sort of summarize this, currently as this EasyTune platform works, it's kind of a master-slave arrangement where Just Autos is providing the calibrations to your slave network who have EasyTune, but currently there's no end user calibration editing.
Not at this stage. The thing is, it'll be probably similar to as it starts to evolve and the hardware's there. End users and so forth will be able to then purchase files from other companies around the world that want to use the platform. So it's basically will be a hosting platform, and we'll be able to provide the log sets and the platform itself in one for them to carry out obviously what they want to do. So it's not about us tuning for everyone. It's the fact that it'll become very similar to, say, like Bootmod or other those companies, if you're familiar with and how they do it, it would be similar to that.
Okay, cool. Maybe for those who have never heard the term WinOLS or OLS before as well, we do have another podcast which goes very, very deep into that with James O'Connor, which we'll link to for people who want to really get down in the weeds with it. But could you give us a quick sort of 1 minute or 30-second overview of what that system is and how it works?
Look, OLS is an editor. It's a very, very powerful bit of software. It's actually fairly cheap to buy. But if you want to get into really understanding and taking away from, say, a company that build with their own definitions into a file, you can put any bin file into that system. And if you know what you're looking for, you can edit it. The problem here is that I think the very first time I picked it up, I was taught by James, who runs a course on here. And
James is the other podcast guest I was talking about. So we're sort of all moving in the same circles here. It's a little bit incestuous, but that's fine.
James is really good. He taught me how to use it back in the day. The first time of picking it up, he blew my mind, and I couldn't pick a laptop up for 2 days, and I just kept coming back to it and doing more and more. But the program it's an amazing program. The problem is that it's very dangerous in the fact that if you're in the wrong spot and you do something wrong, you can cause damage to ECUs very easily. So I suggest to people using it is that definitely get training around it and slow and steady steps with it. Don't try and take on too much, and try and get a good fundamental understanding on where you are and what platform you're using it on. But definitely without training, it's an eye-opener for me. I was expecting the first time to open it up, I was expecting something like OLS, and I remember messaging James late at night, and I said, James, I'm like, hey, why is there no, the axes aren't defined? Like, I don't understand. And he goes, yeah, man, that's your job. And I'm like, what do you mean it's my job? Yeah. Like, I just bought the software. Like, doesn't it do it for me? He goes, no, you got to do it. And I'm like, oh my God. I'm like, this is so much work. And he goes, yeah, welcome to, the world.
It's a very different animal to traditional tuning with a standalone or a commercial reflash package. But for those, we don't have the benefit of pictures here, but for those who maybe still aren't really understanding, essentially OLS is a binary editor. We can download the raw binary file out of the ECU. That just contains all of the information of everything the ECU does and thousands of things we don't care about. But the key is that within that binary file somewhere will be our driver's torque request map, probably 6 or 7 of them maybe, and all of the other maps that we actually need. And by using, maybe we've got an A2L file which tells us the address of these maps, or maybe using pattern recognition, because we can view all this data as a 2-dimensional sort of view. And, we start to learn with experience that a driver's torque request table or driver's wish table looks a certain way. Maybe our wastegate position table or VNT table is going to look a certain way, same with EGR, etc. We can start to define those maps, but it's a very slow process and it's quite difficult. So it's definitely not for everyone, but it is a very powerful piece of software because we can essentially use this with any ECU. So it doesn't matter if you're dealing with BMW or Ferrari or...
Well, you know what I mean? Like, that's the crazy thing about this software is that you can literally put anything in it. And if you know what you're looking at, yeah, you can make the modifications, that's for sure.
All right, I want to move on. I haven't forgotten that we hijacked the talk about Just Autos. I fully intend to come back there. I've got one more topic I want to add in here, though, which is the subject of emissions, which is it's a bit of a hot potato, particularly when I deal with anyone in North America. They clam up immediately and don't really want to talk to me too much in case they say the wrong thing. Obviously, the EPA over there is hot on tuning at the moment. So, yeah, fair play. Diesels, I think, have got a bad reputation because they are quite dirty, and the amount of emissions devices that are now added in order to try and clean them up. So I'm talking here about exhaust gas recirculation, or EGR. I've already talked about DPF, diesel particulate filter, which tends to take all of the particulate matter out of the exhaust. We also have diesel exhaust fluid, or DEF, as well as a selective catalyst. I mean, there's a lot of things going on here. I think in the aftermarket, generally, there's a perception that all of these things should be unbolted from the engine and thrown in the trash straight away, and that's essential and also, most importantly, going to pick up a huge amount of power. That hasn't been my experience. I'm interested in your take on emissions devices.
Yeah, look, we all have to abide to some degree. Like, I mean, at the end of the day, they're there for a reason, and it's not really about my opinion on if they should or shouldn't be. I don't personally like them. I think on a lot of cars, you can still make very good gains with having these control systems in place. Perfect example, some of the later model cars, by removing the DPF, they have baffle plates inside those containers. And the reason for that is to slow the exhaust gases down so that they go through the filter correctly. You know, when we're starting to push power, any restriction like that, it changes the amount of exhaust manifold back pressure we have and also the amount of flow. So therefore, we're limited by how much power we can make with them. So in that case, people say there's no difference with removing a DPF and having a straight pipe and then having one. Well, that's totally wrong. If you're actually looking at the data, you will see that the duty will be completely different to control that turbo now. And the pig control will be working extremely hard one way to try and solve its problem. So there is obviously changes that you can see there by analysing the data. Now, when we start to talk about if it's worthwhile doing, some models, yeah, definitely. Some models, not so much. And you'll find that, do they need to be there? Look, all the emission control devices that we see along the road always tend to cause some sort of problems with the operation of that engine at some point in its life. So it's an inconvenience of having it.
I think one of the sort of uglier ones is exhaust gas recirculation, because if anyone sort of pulled an intake manifold off a high mileage diesel vehicle, typically they're going to be full of deposits and sludge, and it's pretty ugly, correct?
Yeah, and the thing is that I look at about all that sort of stuff. There's a lot more things that go into it, and I think we're so set on looking at a window in a certain time frame for everything. And I think when the car's in perfect form in operation in a window of say 5 minutes in that form, yes, it's great, it complies, it's great for the environment, everything's good. I think if you put the car in a 10-year picture and look at it like that, I don't know if it's really the right thing to do with all the emission control devices, because I look at things like, creating the device to start with, destroying it at the end, obviously the cleaning of EGR systems. If you start to equate all those bits and pieces into it, like even for a DPF point, for a lot of the regeneration DPFs, they're regenning, some of them every 120 kilometers, right? So we're putting in more fuel now. Obviously, they're not going to emit emissions while they're doing a regen. And, I've seen reports of they emit 500 times the legal limit while they're doing a regen. Now, the thing is here is that I feel as though it's a bit like a capture, where you're holding time in capturing it for a certain amount of time, but then you're releasing it. It's not really better overall.
But for the emissions drive cycle testing, we're happy. It gets it through, green tick, happy days. Whereas the overall sort of birth to death of the vehicle, maybe not quite as clean as we're led to believe.
Yeah, and look, I've tried to do a lot of testing around this because of backing up sort of what I'm saying. It's not really a can of worms that I want to open up exactly, but when you look at it and try and be sensible in the situation and look at what we're trying to achieve here, we're using more fuel to do this. We're using more energy to create this and destroy this. There's more of that. That equates to more emissions. I don't care what you have to think about it. It has to, and that's something that I strongly believe in, that it's a little bit smoke and mirrors to some degree. I'm sure that's great, but some of the Euro 6 stuff, I'm surprised that the factory cars comply with that, and that's something that eye-opener when you go, hey, moving forward with all these components we're putting on these cars now with AdBlues and everything else, the person who suffers here is actually the consumer, because they pay for this inconvenience, they pay for the problem, and it's a servicing cost and it's a drama overall that it just doesn't seem to be something that you can get away from.
Yeah, I mean, for better or worse, this is the world we live in. Obviously, every country has its own separate emission standards, and I mean, my advice here is we definitely aren't condoning the removal of these devices. You should be sticking to your local emissions laws, and like it or not, that's what we're dealing with. All right, Matt, let's get back to Just Autos. As I say, we kind of hijacked that discussion. So you mentioned when you bought the business, it was all about the old owner, Just, and you lost sort of 50% of your customers. You've sort of moved into this diesel market. Bring us up to speed with where Just Autos is today. So currently, where are you located in Australia? What size is your facility for a start?
Yeah, so we come from that 100 square metre shed, and my wife found us a new shed over in Nambour, it's actually called the little suburbs Burnside, which is in the Sunshine Coast, Queensland. That shed at the time for us was about 600 metre floor space and about 300 mezzanine. And over the last few years, we've taken over another part of that building as well, which is another, I think, couple hundred square metres. And we went from myself having just one employee, which was an apprentice, to now we have around 20 staff, I think.
Oh, wow. It's a pretty big operation.
Yeah, so it's definitely bigger. I have a sales team. I've got 4 sales guys on the counter that just purely work in sales. I've got different divisions for different things now set up through as you get bigger. Obviously, we have a distributor network as well. So we've got guys that control that and make sure that, stock levels and ordering. And there's the R&D side as well, there's a lot going on. There's different elements to it. So it's definitely very, very different from where I started out as a mechanic doing servicing to then where I am today with doing that.
So give us a sort of an overview of the services that you're offering. I'm guessing that there is still general servicing. You're doing tunes, and you've also mentioned about hardware parts with your sales team. So give us an understanding.
Yeah. So our design of our business is that we actually don't offer servicing. We don't do very little any of that. We're actually purely performance on the packages that we provide for the Toyota vehicles. So we have stages from 1 to sort of 3 packages for most of the models of the cars. We don't do any of the older vehicles. We only really are listing from sort of that Hiluxes in the 1KDs all the way up to the current Model 300 series and the Tundras that are currently out at the moment. And we have reasonable package in that. We used to look and focus about power and so forth, but now the way that we control our packages is being suitable for what 80% of our customers are really looking for, is having the power but reliability and the drivability around that. And so that's our focus of our business. So we have the ability now where we still do diagnosing and some repairs as far as injector replacements and turbos and all that sort of stuff is still happening, but general servicing, we don't do that anymore. And on a daily basis, we're looking at adding and doing R&D on the packages for the new models of cars. For example, the Tundra, we've been working on that for the last year and a half now. We bought one that was from America, so it's not, it's similar to the one that's coming here, but because there was nothing available, we get a head start on that. It allows us to start to develop things for that and have a good look into the inside of that. Same thing with all the models. We just got the new 250 Prado, which just been released here in Australia. We've got that in development at the moment as well. So there's all of those things are sort of happening in the sideline. So on a day-to-day running of the business is that we're just providing that service to our customers for the packages that we provide. So that's anything from hardware where we're putting in heat exchangers, air boxes, exhaust, and obviously tuning that goes with that. And there's slightly different variations on all those packages, but that's what we do on a day-to-day. So At Just Autos, I guess we provide, it's not just about the tuning or the hardware, it's the whole thing. It's the service that we give, the support, the backup, everything around that is what we're providing. And, we're very passionate in that and making sure that our customers are extremely happy with what they're getting. And we spend the time to go through that process with them as well. It's not something where it's like, here's a tune, kick you out the door and see you later. We go through that and we make sure that, the customer is receiving everything the way that I'd want it to be.
Yeah, okay. Perfect. I guess an obvious question that comes out of this is, clearly you're Toyota through and through. I would think, particularly with sort of my understanding of the Australian market, that the Ford Ranger would probably be another obvious one to support. There's thousands of those over there, huge with tradies, no interest in breaking the mold and moving away from Toyota.
Definitely not. It was actually a decision on overall that the people that are very close to us in our business we're talking about it, and the Toyota was the direction that was the car for me. Like, it was the one that I loved to work on. It's the one I knew the best. The decision was like, well, wouldn't it be good to work on those exact cars every day because we know them so well?
Yeah, there's definitely a huge advantage from knowing a car back to front, inside and out. We had this with my old shop when we started specialising in Holden and HSV tuning, and the guys knew all the tricks in fitting a cam or headers in an exhaust system. It was done quickly and the tune was quick and easy, and it's just repetitive business. It is definitely a bit more of a cash machine than the one-offs where you're learning every single car that comes in the door, and you can do a better job.
I guess you're right. Look, there's money to be made when you do things efficiently, for sure. But it was mainly around that we wanted to be able to, like, my mechanics aren't stressed out. They're not in a stressed environment. They're not worried about the job they're doing because they know it so well. My tuners know exactly what to do because they've done so many of them. There's not a car that comes in with a problem that we probably haven't seen before. You know what I mean? So from a diagnostic point of view, we just go through the process and we get through it. My sales guys know what they're talking about with every car. It becomes a better place to work. It becomes better for every way moving forward. So I think once you do that, because you pick up efficiencies in those areas, that naturally will be more profitable by doing that. But it was a hard decision because I wasn't a believer. I really wasn't at the start. I was like, I don't think this is a great decision because we had a large volume of work in a year of other models of cars. Like, we did everything. And the big problem was I was stressed out of my brain because I was literally running on adrenaline all day, like from one car to the next, just trying to fix problems. And it was a lot of the time you're trying to put out fires or understand, what's going on with that car. And it's what I've always struggled, even with my apprenticeship, was when I become qualified, I never felt like I deserved, I felt anxious when I got my qualification because I didn't feel like I knew enough. And I never felt like I deserved to have that piece of paper saying, hey, you're a qualified mechanic, because in our industry, there's just so much knowledge and there's so much stuff to actually learn along the way. And that was something that was really interesting. So, as we start to go through Just Autos and my guys, learning the knowledge around the cars and having that confidence with those particular vehicles, I think that's priceless. And it then changes your mindset on those cars because it becomes easier for us to do because we're doing it all the time,
Yeah, no, makes sense. All right, Matt, I think we'll move towards wrapping this thing up. I've probably taken enough of your time at this point. We've got the same 3 questions to wrap up that we ask all of our guests. And the first of those is, what's next in the future for you and Just Autos?
Look, as we evolve, we've got more distributors going on board. So next year, we've got a larger rollout of distributors around Australia. And then we'll start branching out into other places around the world with that. EasyTune's expanding at the same time with us. So it's something that we're bringing along for the ride. So it's all happening together. Obviously, we've got the new models of cars coming out with the Tundras, so we're working heavily in that field with the Tundras, and the new 300 series is on the horizon as well, so we'll be heavily focused around that and spending a bit more time in the hybrid scene, which is another thing that's coming up, which is we're starting to dabble in, which is good. So, overall, next year is going to be another big R&D year of understanding and getting through systems. And then, I think we're just progressively growing, and it's at a steady rate, and it's controllable, and it's good. So.
Without sort of derailing the last 3 questions, I guess just something that popped to mind, what's the sort of R&D time when you take in a brand new vehicle, and from sort of learning that vehicle, working on the calibration, testing the calibration to a point where you've got a saleable tune or upgrade package for customers?
6 to 12 months, roughly. It's not something that happens overnight because there's so much information. So yes, you can probably get some sort of result on the table within the first 2 days. You know what I mean? But there's a lot more that goes into it than just that. So, as far as how we go through with our multi-mapping sets and understanding how to go through all that, and then also understanding the customer who wants the vehicle and what their requirements are. And, every model is so different. It's not an easy process, and it's something that we don't actually put a time frame around it too much. We know we do a scope on what we need to do with that car. And, on average, it ranges around that, 6 to 12 months to be able to complete a project.
Okay. Second question, is there any advice you'd give to a younger version of yourself to help reach where you are today in your career faster? Or for that matter, any advice to overcome some pitfalls or hurdles that you've come across during your career?
Look, I think I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for my wife. Definitely having a partner that believes in you, that makes you, I guess, I may be the face of the business and so everyone talks to me, but the behind scenes, it's so important for a lot of that stuff to happen. And there's so many meetings and, accountants and all the stuff that, most business owners would be shaking their head going, yeah, I know what sort of goes on. And it's all doing that stuff properly that allows me to do my stuff properly. And that's what people forget. So that's an extremely big part. But also I'd say surrounding yourself with good people, finding the good people in the industry that you can trust makes a huge difference to success. And, I think that don't be naive. You can learn something from everyone, no matter the skill set. And that's something that I do believe. I think in our industry, if you're arrogant or ignorant to something, you're just going to put up a wall and not really look into it. And I've been proven wrong so many times, and still to this day, I'm okay with that, because it's definitely my failures, my successes that I find going through. And I've failed a lot. There's no doubt about it. But you just get up and you keep going through it. And the most important thing is you got to take something from that. You got to learn something from that failure.
Yeah, I think it just couldn't agree more with what you said there. We've talked about this time and time again on the podcast, but the usual sort of entrepreneurial trap is you get into business because you're good at a thing, but then you quickly realize that running a business is only maybe 50% doing the thing, and the other 50% is all of the mindless bullshit that goes with business. And most entrepreneurs, I find, and I fall into this class as well, they're good at the thing and they enjoy that thing and maybe don't enjoy the rest of the business stuff that goes along with it. On top of that, the sort of staying humble, realizing that there's always going to be stuff that you don't even know that you don't know. I think that open-mindedness is critical, because as soon as you start becoming arrogant and think that you know it all, you close your doors down and that's just not going to end well. Right, last question for today, Matt, and we'll let you get out of here. If people want to follow you and see what you're up to, how are they best to do so? What are your websites and social media, etc.?
Yeah, a lot of stuff, probably easiest just to go onto our Just Autos website. If you Google Just Autos or Just Autos Diesel Performance, you'll see our pages. We also have an Easy Tune website as well. There's a lot of support around that, but majority of those links are linked up. That would probably be the best way to get in contact and see what goes, is following us on our socials, and Just Autos in Instagram or Just Autos on Facebook.
Ideal. And as always, we'll add those links into the show notes so that it's nice and easy for people to find you. Look, thanks for your time today, Matt. It's really been great to get some background on the diesel tuning industry. I don't get to talk to too many people that are that deep in the industry, particularly when it comes to Toyota. So yeah, thanks for coming on board.
No, I appreciate the time. It's awesome.
No worries. If you enjoyed this episode of Tuned In with Matt, we'd love it if you could drop a review on your chosen podcasting platform. These reviews really help us to grow our audience, and that in turn helps us to continue to get more high quality guests. To say thanks, each week we'll be picking a random reviewer and sending them out an HPA t-shirt free of charge anywhere in the world. This is also a great place to ask any questions you might have too, and I'll do my best to answer them if your review gets picked. So this week, a big shout out to Orifin from New Zealand, who has said, "All you could want. Love the work of HPA. Their training courses and podcast taught me enough to build all kinds of components for my personal car, whilst being inspired by builds all around the world. Legends." Well, thank you for your kind words. And if you get in touch with your shipping details and your t-shirt size, we'll get a fresh t-shirt shipped straight out to you. All right, that concludes our interview. And before we sign off, I just wanted to mention, for anyone who's been perhaps hiding under a rock and hasn't heard of High Performance Academy before, we are an online training school and we specialize in teaching a range of performance automotive topics, everything from engine tuning and engine building through to wiring, car suspension and wheel alignment, data analysis, and race driver education. Now remember, you've got that coupon code. You can use podcast75 at the checkout to get $75 off the purchase of your first course. You'll find our full course list at hpacademy.com/courses. Important to mention that when you purchase a course from us, that course is yours for life as well. It never expires. You can rewatch the course as many times as you like, whenever you like. The purchase of a course will also give you 3 months of access to our gold membership. That gives you access to our private members only forum, which is the perfect place to get answers to your specific questions. You'll also get access to our regular weekly members webinars, which is where we touch on a particular topic in the performance automotive realm. We dive into that topic for about an hour. If you can watch live, you can ask questions and get answers in real time. If the time zones don't work for you, that's fine too. You're going to get access as a gold member to our previous webinar archive. We've got close to 300 hours of existing content in that archive. It is an absolute goldmine. So remember that coupon code podcast75. Check out our course list at hpacademy.com/courses.